Welcome to NeoUnrealist. George Soros. I've got to say, I am amused by this New York Times headline that appeared yesterday, October 31st, 2018. It says, how vilification of George Soros moved from the fringes to the mainstream. You know, a lot of you who watch this channel, you might not be old enough to remember, but a lot of you probably are. The New York Times is acting like George Soros is some kind of new player on the world stage. That suddenly, scary Republicans led by the bad orange man, President Trump, are vilifying George Soros in some dog whistle reference to an international Jewish conspiracy. I submit to you that all the dogs in Washington, they've got to be dead by now with the daily invocation of the dog whistle trope. Let me say flat out that yes, for people who hate Jews or who traffic in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, George Soros is a popular target for their ire. If you're someone who wastes their time trying to figure out exactly how many Jews were put to death by the Third Reich, or who keeps a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion on your bookshelf, you probably have a lot to say about George Soros. What the New York Times is doing, though, is using that fact that anti-Semites hate George Soros and make up a lot of stuff about him to cover the fact that George Soros really is a bad guy. George Soros is, apart from maybe some of the more ruthless Russian oligarchs, the closest thing that the world has to a real-life cackling James Bond-style villain stroking the cat, sitting in the chair. The New York Times counts on the fact that much of the public has a short attention span and a short memory. George Soros has been criticized for his wrongdoings and even crimes going back over 3 decades, and it wasn't the far right and anti-Semites doing the bashing. A lot of people, especially those that are in those extremist circles, they start their bashing of George Soros by claiming that he was a Nazi collaborator during World War II. Now, the Germans, they occupied Hungary in 1944 when Soros would have been 14, and his father had previously changed the family name from the German Jewish surname of Schwartz to Soros, and obtained false papers to identify the family as Christian. And he was sent to work for the guy that they falsely listed as his godfather at a firm that did assist the Nazi occupation in seizing Jewish property. That's a fact, but I'm not going to hold stuff that Soros was made to do by his father in order to not get deported to a death camp, and perish in the Holocaust against him, especially not. He was only 14 or 15 at the time. No, my problems with George Soros, they don't stem from stuff he did as a teenager to survive the Holocaust. During the early and mid-1980s in the Reagan administration, George Soros was actually a positive influence in helping people in the Eastern Bloc countries like Poland, throw off the yoke of communism in the Soviet Union. Back then, his open society, which, believe me, that'd be a whole other video to talk about that, the open society. They helped fund Poland's solidarity movement and Charter 77 in the former Czechoslovakia, for example. Now, the first blip that appears on the radar that Soros is a bad actor was when a French banker approached him back in 1998 for help buying up shares in, I guess the best way to describe it was a bank. It was Societe Generale, or SocGen, as the French would call it for short, and they were privatizing the bank. And while Soros said no to that French banker, he was a guy named Georges Peribot, he clearly knew that a group of French investors was being organized to do a takeover of, SocGen. Soros, knowing that the shares were about to be bought up in a takeover play, he accumulated a large position in Societe Generale. And the regulators for the French stock exchange, they investigated those trades. And in 1989, they investigated for insider trading. But initially, they didn't file charges against him right away. It wasn't until 2004, when the French appeals court took up the case, they convicted Soros of insider trading and levied a fine of nearly $3 billion. Which was later reduced to reflect the actual profit that he made. I think they reduced it to $1 billion, but whatever. Okay, so Soros was a shady insider trader, and he got off just with a big fine for doing stuff that in that same year 1989, Michael Milken went away. He got 10 years in federal prison here in the United States for doing the same sort of stuff. Michael Milken, for those of you who weren't even born in the 1980s, he was called the junk bond king. He was known euphemistically, those things were called high-yield bonds. Go look into the history of Milken and Drexel Burnham Lambert if you want to know about how the sharks made money during the high-flying 1980s. Anyway, if that was the sum total of Soros, I mean, no big deal. There's a million guys out there who've made money, getting a little edge with some info. This is where Soros, he started to turn sinister and hurt people, or at least that we know of. In 1992, Soros, or the people under him anyway, brought to his attention that the UK was in bad shape with regard to the European exchange rate mechanism. The UK had this was before they were officially the EU. They still didn't, they didn't have a common currency yet. They didn't have the euro. The UK had 3 times as much the rate of inflation as Germany. And their interest rates were too low relative to the other European countries. And they weren't letting the pound float relative to the other currencies. So George Soros, he sees that and he goes, wow, that can't go on forever. He shorted the hell out of the British pound. This maniac built up a short position of $10 billion in British pounds. Now, if you don't know what that means, he sold off $10 billion worth of British pounds that he didn't have in anticipation that a few months later, he could fill those short sales at a lower cost. He was basically betting that the pound would be worth less. Let's say it was a 6-month contract. That 6 months later, he can get the pound cheaper and then fulfill the sell contract that he did. The problem with shorts is, if you've never traded stock before, that they can in and of themselves become a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, because what you end up with is, other investors, they see Soros building up this massive short position on British pounds, and then they start piling on, and before you know it, it becomes a straw that breaks the camel's back. Well, on September 16th, it became too much for the Brits. They pulled out of the European exchange mechanism and they let the pound float. Soros made more than $1 billion out of that fiasco. The British Treasury got kicked in the balls, the British taxpayer, mind you, to the tune of £3.4 billion sterling. And the UK's Telegraph newspaper, in a later story, they basically detail how George Soros was labeled the Archvillain of Black Wednesday. The billionaire who broke the Bank of England. That's the first time I had heard of George Soros. Remember, this guy left Hungary, basically as a refugee, to go study at the London School of Economics. And here he was, more or less, if he didn't entirely cause Black Wednesday on his own and hurt the savings of millions of regular British people and the taxpayers, he sure didn't help matters. Soros was like a guy who, when he saw a drowning man, rather than just doing nothing, he tossed him a bowling ball. And note that subheading of the title again, George Soros, Archvillain of Black Wednesday. What was it that the New York Times headline and story says? How vilification of George Soros moved from the fringes to the mainstream. The New York Times is claiming that somehow the Republican Party of the United States and Donald Trump mainstreamed vilification of George Soros. Here is George Soros being named not a villain, but an archvillain in the United Kingdom's broadsheet newspaper of record. The Telegraph is the UK's largest circulation broadsheet newspaper and is distributed internationally. It was founded in 1858. The Daily Telegraph named George Soros back in 2002 in that story. They're writing the story of how Soros was made out to be the arch-villain in the Black Wednesday crash in the UK in 1992. So remember that George Soros, he had not intervened in U.S. politics in any major way until the 2004 Bush re-election campaign. So it's got nothing to do with American politics or anti-Semitism, unless the New York Times wants to accuse the British government of John Major. and the Daily Telegraph of being closet anti-Semites back in the 90s and early 2000s. But wait, there's more. Soros admitted that his actions bringing down the British pound benefited no one but himself. Not content to ravage the economy of a major world economic power, which clearly the UK is resilient and was able to recover eventually from that major financial crisis, Soros then turned his attention to the weak East Asian economies. He shorted the hell out of the Malaysian ringgit and the Thai baht back in 1997, and in a replay of 1992, was instrumental as one of the currency manipulators who triggered the Asian financial crisis of 1997. The Thai baht collapsed first when the Thai government couldn't get enough foreign currency to keep pegging the baht to the dollar anymore. Thailand had so much foreign debt, they were broke anyway, even absent the currency crisis, and this started a domino effect that spread the crisis throughout Southeast Asia and Japan, but worst of all, in Indonesia, Thailand, and South Korea. You had the leaders of all these foreign countries pointing the finger at currency speculators, some naming George Soros personally. Most famously, Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad denouncing fund managers like Soros as, quote, unscrupulous profiteers. He accused Soros and other fund managers of engineering the crisis. You have to understand, these countries, they were basket cases. A lot of their problems were self-created and a result of bad governance and the actions of internationalist bodies like the World Bank and the IMF, International Monetary Fund. It was a mess. But this whole feud with Soros, it did have a scapegoating element. I mean, but the thing is, they weren't entirely wrong. There was a predatory aspect to what Soros was doing. And there were literally riots and tanks in the streets, and he was shorting into these people's currencies and contributing to driving the currencies down. He was crashing their economies. But just so you don't think that Mahathir Mohamad's criticism was all just some Muslim prime minister using the convenient and useful in the Islamic world trope of accusing a Jewish banker for all their problems, none other than Paul Krugman. Yes, the infamous Democrat, and unless I'm mistaken, just so happens to be Jewish himself. Yes, that Paul Krugman wrote of George Soros in his 1999 book, The Accidental Theorist, and other dispatches from the dismal science. Nobody who has read a business magazine in the last few years can be unaware that these days there really are investors who not only move money in anticipation of a currency crisis, but actually do their best to trigger that crisis for fun and profit. These new actors on the scene do not yet have a standard name. My proposed term is Soroi. There you have someone who is regarded internationally as a leading leftist economist, the leading voice and guy that Democrats and their liberal media allies go to for quotes on the economy, the very Jewish Paul Krugman, labeling the people who do their best to trigger currency crises around the globe for fun and profit. He proposed that they be known as Soroi, due to George Soros being the prime example of that group. What do you call someone who causes people pain for fun and profit? A villain. So don't tell me, New York Times, about Donald Trump or anyone else, quote-unquote, vilifying George Soros out of some anti-Semitic bent, because going back to the 1990s, before he ever started giving large donations to the Democrat Party or funding cutout groups that then take his money and hand it to leftist perpetual protest groups or people like David Brock, he'd already been dubbed an archvillain in the British mainstream press. He was hated throughout Southeast Asia for his role in destabilizing their countries, to the point of threatening to topple the governments and cause major civil unrest in the streets. Leftist economic guru Paul Krugman named an entire class of finance thugs who were running around the world deliberately triggering financial crises. He wanted to name them after George Soros in his own book, and we're only up to the year 1999. I haven't even hit the 2000s yet. But I'm not even going to talk about George Soros and most of the stuff he's been doing since 2004, when he became heavily involved in U.S. politics, when he became more or less the single largest donor to the Democrats and leftist causes in the United States. None other than Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Bibi Netanyahu, the duly elected leader of the Jewish people in their homeland of Israel, has accused George Soros of funding a campaign against the Israeli plan to deport thousands of asylum seekers from the African nations of Eritrea and Sudan. This article, appearing in the Israeli left-wing newspaper Haaretz, is dated February 4th, 2018. Is Haaretz not a mainstream voice for reporting? Is the Prime Minister of Israel not a mainstream voice? Is the Likud party minister who originated the claim about outside funding of those protests against the deportations, Ophir Akunis, is he an anti-Semite too? Is Benjamin Netanyahu dog whistling for, anti-Semitic supporters in Israel? I could see why President Trump calls outlets like the New York Times purveyors of fake news. Because that headline is patently false and they know it's false. Unless somehow Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the chosen leader of the Jewish people, and now the longest serving Prime Minister in the history of the Jewish state, is not a mainstream voice, or somehow trying to draw upon some hidden reservoir of anti-Semitism inside the Jewish population of Israel, unless Paul Krugman was some Jew-hating, non-mainstream voice when he wrote his book nearly 20 years ago, or unless the prime ministers of the, 10 ASEAN countries who denounced the currency manipulation of George Soros back in 1997, unless they're not mainstream, if the government of the United Kingdom under Tory Prime Minister John Major back in the 1990s was not in the quote-unquote mainstream, unless the entire regulatory and court system of the French Republic from 1989 to 2006 is not in the mainstream, when they convicted Soros of insider trading and fined him billions of dollars for his crimes, then George Soros has been vilified. The Daily Telegraph even used the freaking word, Archvillain. He's been vilified in the mainstream for 30 years now. It isn't about some grand Jewish conspiracy or a bunch of made-up bullcrap. George Soros is a bad guy, a known bad guy, long before the media fell out of love with Donald Trump and started their crusade against the bad orange man. It's okay to criticize George Soros. That's all for this NeoUnrealist. Like the video, comment, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell to keep up with the new content. To contribute to the operation of the channel, follow the links to Patreon or PayPal below, or use the tip pledge button if you're watching this on BitChute. Thanks for watching.